Thanks very much for having me here. So I'll be discussing negotiating for both career and salary advancement at UK. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a chaired professor in the management department in the business school, and I used to be a fellow at Penn State's Center for Research on Conflict and Negotiations. And for about 15 years, I've been assisting the female faculty and staff on this campus with numerous negotiations. Uh, One thing I want to say before we begin is that you'll see that I have a particular bias, which is that I think that the entire University of Kentucky is run on the back of women that are underpaid for what they do. We don't have gender equity here at the University of Kentucky, and negotiations are one of the ways that you can help towards fixing this problem. So one of the issues that come up whenever we talk about gender and negotiations is what's called the negotiating gap. And one of the things that we know, for example, is that if we look at men and women in the same MBA program, so this was actually, there was a study done at Northwestern. They had men and women, same grades, same majors, in other words, the same skill level. They were going into the same entry-level positions at the same firms. And yet what we saw was that they negotiated for different amounts. So women received 2.7% above their initial offer, men 4.5%. And the question was why? And it turned out that the men were negotiating harder. And if you think to yourself, well, that seems like such a small difference, well, all of those little differences, especially early on in your career, become greatly magnified over a lifetime of work. So that's part of the reason why you're beginning to see, for example, the state of Massachusetts legislating that, hey, you can't ask somebody about their prior salary during current salary negotiations, because obviously if women are starting out at a lower level, then this is going to influence where they end up in their next negotiation. So this is something that we're going to keep coming back to, which is we don't want to be looking backwards to how much we were being paid before, but rather forwards to how much we should be getting paid for the job that we're doing now and that we will be doing in the future. So why do we see this difference in negotiating? Well, part of it is because we need to pay more attention to this equation, and women in certain places, on average, don't do what men do. And so one of the things I want to get you comfortable with during this hour is that negotiating is fine to do, you should do it, and it's expected at all times. So the first place I'm going to begin with this equation on how you become a better negotiator is to actually think about what negotiating performance actually means. What does it mean to have a good outcome? So how will you know if the negotiation you went into was successful? So sometimes I will, for example, interact with a staff member and she'll tell me, I want a raise. And my first question back to her is why? And she'll often look at me like I'm nuts, but here are two different answers I've received. So I've received the answer, I don't feel valued as much as other people, in other words, the men in my department, versus I haven't had a market adjustment in 10 years and my children are going to college soon, I need the money. Those are two very different answers. And if you go into the negotiation just asking for money, but really what the issue is that you don't feel valued and you don't feel like people are paying enough attention to your input, then if you don't ask for that to change, that's not going to change. And the day after you sign a deal that gets you more money, you still will have the same problem that you had going into it. So the first thing about negotiating well is understanding what is it that you want and why. So unless you know the true reasons for getting into the negotiation, you're not going to get good performance. And you need to be really honest with yourself. Why is it that you want to negotiate? So the next aspect of the negotiation equation is being motivated to negotiate. So this is a strange thing that we've seen from a lot of research. Women don't negotiate for themselves as hard as men do. Again, all these things that I'm going to say is on average. It's actually very strange because if we put women in charge of negotiating on behalf of somebody else, they negotiate just as hard as men do. But all of a sudden, when they're asked to negotiate for themselves, they don't do it as hard. So that's a very strange thing that we've come across in that negotiating literature. And that's part of what I want to encourage you is to be motivated to negotiate. So what does that mean? Well, the biggest thing that you can do in terms of getting a negotiation moving is to develop alternatives. Alternatives that you would be willing to exercise if the negotiation doesn't go well. So oftentimes I will have somebody say, I really want to move up in my organization. How do I do that? Well, if your answer is only to stay within your current role and try and convince people to move you up, it's going to be a hard slog. It can be done, but it's going to be more difficult. An easier way is to look for another position, whether internal or external to UK, develop that alternative, and then use that to negotiate for either staying or moving into that other position. So men, it turns out, are more willing to switch jobs in order to get to some kind of market value as compared to women, again, on average. So what we want to do when we get into the negotiation is we want to make sure that we are properly valuing wages. But besides just looking at everything else, we want to make sure that we don't devalue the wages. So in other words, oftentimes when I'm trying to work with somebody, they will say, I like my job because I've got a good schedule, it's a good work environment, and so I'm willing to give up money to have that. And that's a healthy attitude, but again, we still want to value the wages. We still want to go after that. And don't assume in the negotiation that you have to trade those things off for wages and bonuses, that it is possible to get more. And hopefully, just knowing the fact that you're making less than men in comparable positions shows you that it's possible to get more in wages. And one of the things I want to highlight to you is that oftentimes, whatever your present wages are, they form that platform for all future wages. So you don't want to give up on these because it has a huge cumulative effect over your career. So whenever I'm working with somebody on negotiating, I want to have the starting point be that you are motivated to try to get everything that you want first and not to go into the negotiation already having conceded on something in your own mind before you even begin the negotiation. Now, I will also say, obviously, we don't want to get entirely hung up on wages. So as an example, I've helped out doctors who have been negotiating, and they have told me that their number one issue was that they wanted more time. And then off they go to negotiate, they come back, and they're all excited about this offer that they got, which featured much, much higher wages. And then I asked them, so how's the time? And they're like, oh, it's worse than what I have now. And I'm thinking, well, so are we going to change our order of what we care about? No, time is still my number one thing. And I'm looking at them and it's like, you're smiling way too hard for somebody who hasn't gotten what they wanted. And what ends up happening in negotiations is that oftentimes they take on a life of their own and people forget what they're looking for. So what I want you to do when you're negotiating is not focus exclusively on the wages, because we want to, again, get everything that we want. We want to think about what is going to bring value to us together, all of it. So another aspect of being motivated to negotiate is I really need you to not think of a negotiation as a one-time event. A really good negotiation tends to be pretty tough, and it takes a while. So you don't want to head for a quick deal. You want to get the right deal. So one of the things that we often get into is that sometimes people get tired of negotiating and they end up needing a break. I've helped out faculty members where we've worked for 2.5 years to finally get to the end of a negotiation, and that's not unusual. That can happen, but at the end of it, they got something that was career changing, and so it was worth it. So it can take a long time to finally get to what you need. What you want to do is make sure that you don't just sign something because you're getting tired. You want to sign the right thing, no matter how much time it takes. So I titled this slide, "What if the other party says no?" And what I should title this is, "What do you do when the other party says no?" Because no is the first thing that they're going to say to most of the things you're going to ask about. And a motivated negotiator understands that's just the starting point. Don't worry about that. The first thing I want to ask back is why? Why are you saying no? And then listen carefully. So for example, when I was moving from Tulane to Emory, I asked for a signing bonus. And the associate dean at Emory said no. And my question back was why? And he said, basically, I don't want to give a signing bonus because if I give it to you, every other faculty member will ask for that from here on out. And so I said, okay, I hear that. So you don't want to set a precedent. And he said, right. I said, well, okay, are there other reasons why you don't want to do this? And he just laughed and said, no, that's a pretty good reason. So at this point, I understand, all right, the precedent is the issue. So now we can start to get creative. How do I get around this problem? So I told him, look, I need it because I need to put a down payment on a house. I don't have the money to do that. It's going to be very difficult for me to convince my wife to move. Can you help me out? And he was the one that actually got very creative and said, hey, if it's for a house, I can give you a housing supplement and you can use it towards the house. So nowhere in the contract did it ever say that I got a signing bonus, but my housing supplement was way higher than it would have been. And that's the kind of thing that can happen in a negotiation where one party can say no, but it's because they don't want to set a precedent, but you can get a creative solution. And that's what you want to be able to get to. But if you get angry or you cut off the negotiation just because somebody said no, you'll never get to that creative solution. And the way that you do it is that you try to understand their underlying interest. The position is they said no. The interest is why. Why are they caring about this? And it's really important for both parties to explain each other's interests, especially in a career negotiation where it should be a very collaborative negotiation. When I say collaborative, it's not that I'm being easy. I want to get what I want to get, but I am going to try to push for everything while being very nice, because at the end of the day, if we do agree, I'm going to have to work with these people for years to come. So I don't want to be a jerk, but I still want to get what I need. So the idea is to try to seek creative solutions that satisfy everybody. these kinds of creative solutions take all sorts of um, forms, and we're going to come back to this, but one of the creative ways that keeps coming up at the University of Kentucky are things like hidden money that gets paid to somebody. So if you wanted to know, for example, the difference between what men and women make on this campus, it's actually extremely difficult to see that. You can't just go onto a website and look at what it says on there about how much we make, because, for example, I had a deal where here I wanted to have a lower teaching load. And the reason that I wanted that lower teaching load was that the dean didn't want to pay me a higher salary. So what we did was we lowered my teaching load, and then we negotiated for me to teach the same amount, but to get paid a lot more money for that one extra class than what anybody else was getting paid. That creative solution made it so that I was satisfied, so was the dean, but if you look at our salary online, you wouldn't know that that kind of hidden money was coming to me. And that kind of stuff is happening over and over again on this campus. Lots of hidden money, and that really changes the gender gap in wages here on campus. Okay, the next part of the equation is, once the negotiation begins, how do I actually conduct it? So there are a million ways that I can teach you to negotiate better. And the best thing that I can do is to say, when the time comes, text me, let's set up a meeting and let's just talk. And I do that all the time. I really enjoy reaching out to folks, but I'm going to show you some of the various techniques that we talk about. So the biggest tip that I can give you is believe in your value. All right, you are what you are selling. And I know this sounds obvious, but one of the things that I'll run into, for example, is that a woman will be negotiating for a job and she will say, well, you know, a man doing this is getting 100,000, but I don't have as much experience as the person. That last part where you qualify what you're doing is that you're devaluing yourself. You're coming up and dwelling on a negative aspect, your lack of experience, instead of emphasizing the positive aspect. If somebody is offering you a position, they must see you as the best candidate. Why? What are you selling? So you need to sell the other party on all the positive sides and not bring up any of the negative sides. That's their job, not yours, okay? So that seems obvious, but I can't tell you how much time I have to spend just on that one simple thing. Another thing that I will start off by asking you is, tell me about what the market looks like. I don't want to know just the average of how much people make in a particular position, because I don't want you to get an average offer. What I want you to get is a well above average offer, because you're a well above average candidate. So you need data. You need to know what other people have gotten in this position, and specifically most recently. So going online is one way to start to access data, but as we just spoke about, what's online isn't necessarily the truth. It's the starting point and it gives you some idea, but there's often a huge gap between what's online and what's going on in real life. I've calculated this for myself. There's a 28% difference between what it says I make online and what I'm actually bringing home. So the only way to figure out what's really going on is you've got to ask people. And what you want to do is not fall into what's called the homophily trap. Homophily means I'm only asking people that look like myself. Think about this, right? If you're trying to figure out what your economic value is, most of the time, who is the first person you're going to try and ask? You're going to ask other women. This is not a good idea. If we already know that women are making less than men, they're not the right people to be asking. You need to be asking men. And sometimes you're going to have to approach people that you may not feel comfortable approaching. So how do you do this? Well, you just do it. You walk up to people at professional conferences and you say to them, hey, I feel really uncomfortable asking this, but I'm about to head into a negotiation and I need to have a sense of what I should be asking for. Would you help me? And you would be surprised at how willing people are to actually help you do that. So just being able to ask around, and don't ask other women, but rather ask men as well, that will help you to get a better sense. And specifically, you want to go after men that have just recently gotten a position similar to the one that you're looking at. Okay, so some of the winning tactics. We already talked about developing an alternative. So in the negotiating world, we always talk about what's the best alternative if you can't get a deal done. What else will you do? Will you maybe leave? A lot of times it's interesting trying to work with women. I will ask them, have you looked anywhere else? And they will say things to me like, oh, my spouse would never be interested in that. And I always start with the question, have you asked your spouse? And I'm stunned often by how often the answer is no. And it's like, well, why don't we start there? Why don't we begin with testing out, can we develop alternatives? If you can't find what you want in your own department, have you looked at other departments at UK? Have you looked at other universities? Have you looked at private companies in the area? I recently was working with somebody who ended up moving over to Valvoline and is very happy with that move. But to get there, you have to start thinking about alternatives. Then you want to ask yourself, what's what we call your reservation point, or really your bottom line? If you can't get this number, then you're going to execute that other alternative. It's really important in a negotiation to set your bottom line before you begin the negotiation, because once it begins, you can get lost in how hard the negotiation is. So figure out that point above which you will say to yourself, or actually below which you're going to just say, I'm going to exercise my alternative. So then the next question that you should ask yourself is, what's your target? And your target, when you go into a negotiation, you should always be negotiating above your bottom line. So for example, if your bottom line on a job negotiation is $56,000, I'm going to ask you, what do you want to make in this job? What is your target? And if you say to me 65,000, that's your target, you're going to negotiate very differently if 65 is your target versus 56. One of the ways that that ends up affecting things, for example, is that if you get your initial offer and it's 50,000 and your reservation point is 56,000, I'm going to ask you, what are you going to counter with? Normally, what you would counter with points to the midpoint. And we're going to keep coming back to this. So if they offered you 50, you're saying your bottom line is 56, you should go back at 62 And that signals to the other party, we're going to meet in the middle at 56, right? On the other hand, if 65 is your target and they offered you 50, you're going to have to go back to them at 15,000 above your target point. So in other words, 80,000, right? Because you're going to be signaling to them 65. Well, they only offered you 50,000. You're going to go back to them at 80,000. Think about how hard that negotiation is going to be. And we're going to have to really have long conversations about why you think they are way undervaluing you. So that's why we want to set aggressive targets. So you want to be optimistic and you want to push that to try and get much more. So this is an example of what's called a bargaining zone. So you might have a buyer. So this would be, for example, the university, where they may say to themselves, for this position, we won't pay any more than 135, but we're going to advertise it at 120. You may have a seller, the employee, who is saying to themselves, I won't go below 125. That's my reservation point. But I'm going to start off by saying 140 because my target is going to be somewhere higher than 125. That's my bottom line. Your goal is to try and get the whole amount. If UK is willing to pay you 135, you want to get 135 and not a penny less. So one way to try and figure out how much are they willing to pay is to start off by just asking. See if the other party will tell you. They're going to do the same thing to you. They're going to try and ask you, what's your bottom line? You never reveal your actual bottom line. That is something you should never do. If even in an application, if somebody says, what is your bottom line? Try to put stuff in there like negotiable or put $1, whatever it takes. Avoid giving them an actual number.
Hi, Joe. We have a few questions that I think it might be beneficial to tackle right now. Is that okay?
Sure, absolutely.
All right. Our first one I'm going to publish right here, and it says, what can hourly employees do at UK due to the pay range? I thought we couldn't negotiate higher than the top of the range.
Right. So, and I'll get to that in a bit, but basically, these ranges are set. So you have to get yourself into a different pay grade. That's where the negotiation really comes into, is changing your position or even how the university grades your position. So for a staff person, that's really going to be the big thing. And for a staff person, one of the things to think about is that you can leave the university and then return later and be doing virtually the same job, but get moved into a different pay grade because you're being hired into a different job and you bring different experience. So that will be something we discuss more as we go along. Any other questions that you had there?
I think that covers that one and the other one that was connected. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. So most negotiations end at the midpoint. So that tells you that what you want to do is, if there's a bunch of issues, try to get concessions that are more valuable to you on other issues, whether that be time off, bonuses, all kinds of other stuff. When you're conceding, employ a funnel pattern to your concessions. So in other words, if I start off at 140 and in the next round I go to 138, 136, 134, what I don't want to do is keep going like this, because that just tells the other party, keep negotiating. If you keep holding on, I'll drop it to 132 next. But if instead I start at 140, 138, notice I drop 2, then I drop 1, then I drop a half. Now I'm signaling to the other party that we are almost done. So what's weird is that even though 136.5 is more expensive than 134, it's more likely that people will sign this deal because they feel the pressure. Okay, last thing is just external conditions, which can be holding you back. A small percentage, but significant, can also be due to discrimination. And clearly, if you find that your employer is discriminating, you want to go with the EEOC. But I would also add that there may be institutional impediments here on campus that are keeping you from getting paid what you should be getting paid. I used to be on the President's Commission on Women when that still existed, prior to Dr. Capilouto taking over. And we did a study where we looked at faculty salaries, and what we found was that women were significantly underpaid. And we controlled for a lot of things. All these years later, President Capilouto has gotten rid of the President's Commission on Women, has not replaced it, and he asked me, he asked a whole bunch of us, what could we do to make this place better? And I sent him an email, and item 4 was, hey, let's make total compensation data, including deferred compensation by race, gender, and ethnicity, available transparently to the UK community, because I think the gender gap is growing. And a week later, I got the response that everything's fine, right? We commissioned an outside expert study, everything's fine, and we've shared all the data, which is obviously not true. Nobody has ever seen the data. And if you have found any data that suggests otherwise, please share it with us. Well, there is no data because it's all being kept secret. But this is something that, as a community, the women on this campus need to push for, along with your allies, that this needs to be made obvious what is going on. It's happening in the state of Massachusetts, where companies are being required to show what men and women are making, and it's making a huge difference in terms of bringing up women's salaries. Okay, so when you're doing these kinds of negotiations, you never want to use a scorched earth approach. You always want to be very nice, but nice does not mean that I cave. Nice means I'm going to get what I want, but I'm just going to do it in a nice way. Okay, so let's talk about, well, what the question was, which is, how are staff salaries being determined at UK? So a few years back, I had somebody from HR sit down with me and say, okay, how is this working? And what's being done on campus is basically we're trying to depress wages through this system that's been created. So you have this thing which is called a salary range, right? And supposedly it's tied to market surveys. But in reality, it doesn't allow you to make market salaries. So every position within the university is associated with a grade level. Every grade level is associated with a salary range. And these may be old numbers, but it's still the basic idea. If you've got a certain grade of position, then the minimum you can make is a certain amount, the maximum you can make is a certain amount, and it can be a huge gap. So this is a 60% gap. Within that salary range, there's not a lot of movement. and there's a cap, but you can ask for more. So that's the first thing, is that it is possible, but HR is going to be working hard against you making more. So the better thing to be doing is to try to get yourself into a higher grade. To do that, you have to proactively develop your skills. To do that, the best way is to try to involve your managers. So sit down with your manager and try to get them to help you develop your skills and gain experience. Let them know that you're interested in moving into higher positions, and then work with them to create a developmental plan for yourself on how you're going to reach those higher positions, including things like getting a special assignment. So for example, when I was managing staff, I had a staff member. To get her into another grade, what we identified was that she had to have marketing skills. She didn't have marketing skills at that point. So we arranged for her to take a class in marketing, and we arranged for her to do a special marketing assignment. Once she completed those, we could then create a new position for her, essentially, that also included marketing. And by doing that, we moved her into a higher grade, and she was able to be paid more. Now, obviously I'm a professor of management, so I'm thinking that way. Many managers may not be used to developing subordinates, so you might be the one that has to push them to do it. And it might also be important that you look towards mentors from outside your department to be able to get that done. So while you're also here at the University of Kentucky, one of the great things is that make use of any chance that you can to further your education, because that's also a big part of how staff salary quotes are determined. It's a combination of education and experience. And unfortunately, when we talk about education here at UK, they only mean the highest level of education completed. So again, this is another way that the university devalues what goes on. So for example, if I've got somebody who was an engineer as an undergrad and got an MBA versus somebody else who just has their MBA and also had a business degree as an undergraduate, in the marketplace, the combination of engineering and MBA would get you more money. At UK, they don't care. An MBA is an MBA. Whatever you did before that doesn't matter. If you have 2 masters, doesn't matter. All they care about is your highest level. So there's an equivalency that's being created, but in all of these cases, it's really not pulling out your true value. To be able to get your true value, you have to try and get a job somewhere else to be able to bring that back, to really unlock the value here. Another thing is that they say, well, the more experience you have, the better. But it's only related experience. So if you've had a job, but it didn't have management duties, that doesn't count. Only the ones that have management duties count. And again, this is not the case if you go to try to get a job at Valvoline. So when we think about what people are being paid for here, it's really devaluing their entire experience. There's another aspect to this. They're trying to make pay equitable across all kinds of departments. So that equity holds back the people who are doing best, if you think about it. And what will end up happening is that they will set a certain bar for people who have a certain amount of experience. But again, that bar is artificially low. And then even if all of this works out, you still have to clear the last hurdle, which is, does the department's budget work? So you could have done all these things well, convinced your manager, but the department doesn't have the money. and HR has to sign off on it. So you can see that there's all these hurdles. And I know that I'm sounding pretty negative about it, but the reason is because I've seen what happens when somebody will leave a particular position, go to another organization, and they unlock a huge amount of their value. And then later, if they want, they can come back. And what's weird is that you are more valuable to the university. If you've gone and worked at a place like, for example, I keep saying Valvoline or Temper, you now have learned a whole bunch of new things. When you get hired back to UK, you're bringing more to the table than you had previously. So what do you want to do? Make a plan. What do you want? What position do you want to retire from? Start to think ahead. And how do you get from here to there? What qualifications, experience, connections do you need? Lay out a timeline and look for opportunities. Don't try and do this just yourself. Work with other people and think about what is it that you won't give up? What has to be part of it? What's your reservation point? And really, you want to also be thinking about what's the timeline for this? Are you going to be able to do this in the next week? Why would UK give you more money to do what you're already doing? Does your supervisor control the budget? So you may have to think about the timing for all of this. So I was just helping somebody out. She was being underpaid relative to a man in her same department. She learned about that. So the people at the top of her department agreed, yes, you're being underpaid. So now we're in the middle of a pandemic. They said, we can't do anything about this now. Well, guess what I told her? I said, well, all right, go back to them. If they agree that you should be paid at least as much as this person, and they can't do anything about it right now, well, how about this? Why don't you sign a contract right now that says that once the money becomes available, it will be retroactive, right? There's nothing that stops that from happening, from you being made whole for being underpaid. And that also works to their advantage. They may not have the budget today, but a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, eventually they will have the budget. And if you have the contract, they've got to make you whole. So there are all kinds of things that you can do if you're willing to push for it. If you do go after a job at a peer institution, a University of Tennessee, an Ohio State, you have to decide, are you going to interview here? And are you willing to take a counteroffer from here if it comes? So that's another thing to consider. And if you do get an offer and UK doesn't counter, are you prepared to leave? I always tell people that alternatives are not really alternatives unless you're willing to exercise them. I don't like people bluffing. And I think that it's really important that you go out there and try and find something that you can be happy with. Okay, so in conclusion, develop alternatives. Don't be afraid to exercise them. Get data. Seek it from diverse sources. Don't be afraid to negotiate. Everything is negotiable, even when people tell you it's not. It really is. Don't give away your value needlessly. Don't devalue yourself. Really dig in and extend the negotiation to try and get what you need. And don't start conceding right off the bat. Try to get all of your interests satisfied right off the bat.